This is the unsettling story of the Follings, a couple who adopted 12 children over 15 years, none of whom had birth certificates. What started as an inspiring tale of compassion quickly turned into something deeply troubling. Millbrook, a small town nestled in western Pennsylvania's hills, was the last place you'd expect to uncover a story so disturbing it would attract federal scrutiny. Home to under 3,000 residents, Millbrook was the kind of town where everyone knew one another, where community potlucks and high school football games marked the social calendar, and where neighbors still delivered casseroles when someone was unwell. It was here in 1978 that Howard and Margaret Follings settled. Their home was an expansive, Victorian mansion on Elm Street, partly hidden behind old oak trees. The house had stood empty for nearly a decade, earning the nickname, the haunted house on the hill. Howard, a successful investment banker from Pittsburgh, saw potential in the decaying property. With his wife Margaret, a former pediatric nurse, they spent generously to restore the mansion, turning it into a neighborhood landmark. They seemed like such a lovely couple, recalls Elaine Winters, their neighbor of nearly 2 decades. Howard was always well-dressed, even when collecting mail. Margaret was poised and graceful. They made you feel special just by speaking to you. But behind their polished image lay secrets that would eventually shock the community. Public records showed Howard and Margaret couldn't have biological children, a profound disappointment for Margaret, who longed for a large family. She'd watch the neighborhood kids playing for hours from her porch, Winters remembers. She seemed so sad, like she would have been a wonderful mother. Margaret finally seemed to get her wish in 1980 when the Follings adopted their first child, James. The community celebrated, hosting a baby shower and a church blessing. James was a bright, cheerful baby, and the Follings doted on him. Margaret wouldn't let anyone hold him, says Clara Jenkins, a fellow churchgoer. Even during the blessing, when the pastor asked to hold him, she hesitated. Howard had to whisper something to her before she relented, and even then, she stood so close to the pastor it was uncomfortable. At the time, this protectiveness seemed like the behavior of a cautious new mother. But it was the first of many signs that something was amiss. Within 2 years, the Follings adopted a second child, a girl named Elizabeth. Soon after came Thomas, Catherine, and William. By 1985, they had 5 adopted children, all under 6. The pace of these adoptions was unusual, given Pennsylvania's typically slow adoption process. Yet Howard's wealth and connections, coupled with their sterling reputation, silenced any doubts. They were seen as heroes, says Detective Richard Cooper, who later led the investigation. Wealthy, respected people taking in children who'd otherwise be lost to the system. Who'd question that? Yet peculiarities emerged. The Falling children never attended public school. Margaret homeschooled them. The children were rarely seen in town, never far from their parents, never involved in sports or community activities. I tried to arrange a playdate for my son with James, recalls Patricia Hayes, a former Millbrook resident. Margaret always declined. James was sick, busy, or they were traveling. Eventually, I stopped asking. This isolation might have continued indefinitely if not for an accident in 1987 when 9-year-old Thomas fell from a tree and broke his arm. Despite her nursing background, Margaret didn't seek medical help, attempting instead to treat it herself. The bone became infected, and only when Thomas developed a high fever did Howard take him to the ER. Dr. Sarah Chen, who treated Thomas, recalls he was in septic shock. We performed emergency surgery to save his arm, but there was nerve damage. Oddly, he never cried, not even once. When I asked how he got hurt, he looked to his father before answering, like he was waiting for permission. Dr. Chen grew suspicious when she requested Thomas's medical records. and was told they were lost in a fire at the adoption agency. Pressing further, Howard became hostile and threatened to move Thomas to another hospital. "I knew something wasn't right," Dr. Chen says, "but I had no proof, just a feeling." Still, she reported possible medical neglect to Child Protective Services. Caseworker David Morris investigated visiting the home and interviewing the family. His report concluded there was no evidence of abuse. The home was clean, the children seemed well cared for, and Margaret cited her medical background and a personal fear of hospitals to explain her actions. The case was closed. Between 1988 and 1990, the Follings adopted 3 more children, Robert, Anne, and Henry. Some townsfolk began to whisper, how could they adopt so many so fast? Why were the children rarely seen? And why did they all have the same blank expressions? "I watched them at church," says Jenkins. 8 kids sitting in a row perfectly still, never fidgeting or whispering. It wasn't normal. Still, the Follings' wealth, philanthropy, and Howard's local influence discouraged deeper inquiry. That changed in 1992 when the Fletcher family moved nearby. Michael Fletcher was a journalist for the local paper, and his wife Susan, a social worker experienced in child welfare. Mom noticed something wrong with the Falling kids. Immediately, recalls their daughter, Emily Fletcher. They flinched at sudden movements, avoided eye contact, and constantly watched Margaret as if afraid to miss a signal. Susan kept detailed notes on these behaviors and tried to befriend Margaret, gaining occasional access to the Falling home. She once mentioned a locked room on the 3rd floor, Emily says. She heard shuffling and sometimes crying. Margaret said it was just storage, but Mom didn't buy it. In 1993, Susan spotted a girl she didn't recognize at an upstairs window. Margaret dismissed it, but Susan knew all the children by then and was certain this was someone else. Meanwhile, Michael Fletcher was researching adoption fraud and discovered that several agencies in nearby states had been shut down in the 1980s for placing children without proper paperwork, coinciding with the Fallings' first adoptions. Shortly after Michael's articles were published, the Follings announced more adoptions. Twins, Peter and Paul, then a girl named Mary, totaling 11 children. They exploited system loopholes, says Cooper. They worked across states, using previous adoptions to prove credibility, and targeted children from difficult backgrounds, kids less likely to have complete records. But why? Margaret seemed sincere in her desire for a large family, and Howard, though less enthusiastic, supported her. Money wasn't the motive. They were already wealthy and adoption subsidies were minimal. Nor was it for appearances, as their large family drew attention. The truth began emerging in 1995. Susan Fletcher, now terminally ill with cancer, called Cooper, then a junior detective, to her bedside. She handed him a file of observations, inconsistencies, and photos, including the 3rd floor window. She asked him to investigate after she was gone. Susan died on June 12, 1995. Cooper, honoring his promise quietly, began looking into the Follings. He confirmed the family used multiple adoption agencies across 3 states and made large donations each time, not illegal but suspicious. Each child also had a trust fund, but with restrictive conditions. They could only access the money at 25 if they maintained contact with the Follings and didn't search for their biological families. It was about control, Cooper says. Cooper interviewed neighbors, former staff, and teachers who'd seen the children during standardized testing. Household staff never stayed long, usually leaving without a trace. One former housekeeper, Maria Vasquez, was eventually located in Ohio. She initially refused to speak but changed her mind after seeing Susan Fletcher's file. She cried, Cooper recalls. She said, "Someone else knows," then she talked. Vasquez described a strict, punitive environment. The children were isolated, each in separate rooms, forced to call. Howard and Margaret, sir and madam. On the third floor, 3 always locked rooms housed unseen children. Vasquez was only allowed to leave food outside the doors. She left after witnessing Margaret punish James, then 11, by forcing him to stand in a corner all night for speaking out of turn at dinner. Fearful, she fled before dawn. With Vasquez's testimony and Susan's records, Cooper approached his superior but was told to drop it. Howard's influence loomed large. Undeterred, Cooper pursued the case, off the clock, focusing on the third floor. Children unaccounted for in the official records. A breakthrough came from Emily Fletcher, now 19 and studying journalism. She researched missing children in areas where the Follings had adopted and found a pattern. Each adoption was followed by a missing child case within a month. Always vulnerable children from marginalized backgrounds. Emily shared her findings with Cooper, who confirmed through police records that these children were never found, and investigations had been minimal. Cooper recalls bitterly that it was as if these children didn't matter to the system, as though they were disposable. Armed with this understanding, Cooper decided to bypass Chief Wallace and take the case directly to the Pennsylvania State Police. He assembled a comprehensive report that included Vasquez's testimony, Susan Fletcher's notes, Emily's research, and his own findings. He forwarded it to Lisa Harper, a former colleague, now working with a state-level task force on crimes against children. Harper treated the report with the seriousness it deserved. Within a week, she had obtained a warrant to search the Follings residence. But securing the warrant was only the beginning. Carrying out the search would prove to be one of the most difficult operations of Cooper's career. "We knew we had to act quickly and decisively," Cooper explains. "If the Follings caught wind of the operation, they might destroy evidence or worse, harm the children. But the Follings had connections. If word of the search leaked through official channels, the entire effort could collapse." Harper assembled a team of state troopers and agents from the Department of Justice's newly formed Child Exploitation and Obscenity Section. Cooper participated as the local liaison. The strategy was to execute the warrant at dawn, when the household would likely be asleep and less guarded. On the morning of October 23, 1995, a convoy of unmarked cars approached the Follings estate. Officers swiftly secured the perimeter before announcing themselves. Howard Follings, clad in a silk bathrobe, answered the door. According to Cooper, he wasn't surprised to see law enforcement. "He was expecting us," Cooper says. "Somehow he knew we were coming." Howard greeted them as if they were guests arriving for dinner, calm and composed. Margaret Follings, however, reacted very differently. When she realized what was happening, she became hysterical, screaming that authorities had no right to invade their home and claiming they were traumatizing her children. She had to be restrained after physically attacking a female officer. The search began in an orderly manner, with teams assigned to different parts of the house. The 11 known Follings children were located in their bedrooms, all awake despite the early hour, all dressed and sitting upright on their beds as though waiting for inspection. "They didn't respond to us," Harper later reported. "No fear, no curiosity, nothing. It was as if they'd been hollowed out." Attempts to interview the children led to scripted, meaningless answers. Even James, the 17-year-old who could legally speak for himself, simply stated, "Sir and Madam provide everything we need. We are happy here." The true horror awaited on the third floor. As Vasquez had reported, there were 3 locked rooms. When officers forced the doors open, they discovered 3 children, a girl around 10 and 2 boys close to 8. Unlike the Follings children downstairs, these children reacted with fear. cowering in corners and hiding their faces. The conditions were appalling, Cooper recalls, his voice tight with lingering anger. The rooms were nearly empty, just bare mattresses on the floor. There were no toys, no books, nothing that resembled a child's living space. Windows were sealed with blackout curtains nailed in place, and the smell was overwhelming, the stench of children living in squalor. Medical exams later revealed that all three were severely malnourished and bore signs of physical abuse. None spoke English fluently, suggesting they had been taken from non-English speaking homes. Worse still, there were no records for them, no birth certificates, no adoption papers, nothing to prove they officially existed. They were ghosts, Cooper says, children who had been erased from the world. The discovery shifted the case from suspected abuse to something far darker. The FBI joined the investigation, expanding it to include kidnapping, human trafficking, and document fraud. Howard and Margaret Follings were arrested on the spot. As they were led away, Margaret broke free and ran to the staircase, screaming in an unidentifiable language. Experts later suggested it might have been glossolalia, speaking in tongues common in certain religious practices or intense psychological distress. That was when I started to suspect there was a religious angle to what the Follings were doing, Cooper says. Until that moment, he'd believed it was about control, Margaret's obsession with shaping a large family. But her outburst hinted at something deeper, possibly ritualistic. As the investigation progressed, this theory would be disturbingly confirmed. With the Follings in custody, the focus turned to understanding the full scope of their crimes and, more urgently, aiding the victims. The three hidden children were placed in emergency foster care, while the 11 adopted children went to a group home specialized for traumatized youth. Interviewing the children proved difficult. The adopted children stuck to their scripted replies. The three hidden ones were too traumatized to communicate meaningfully. They flinched at sudden movements, avoided eye contact, and became hysterical when separated. They only trusted each other, says Dr. Evelyn Marraro, a child psychologist working with them. Understandable given their isolation. Their only human contact had been with each other and Margaret, who visited to administer what she called treatments. Through art therapy, the children described these treatments, being forced to drink a bitter liquid that made them sleepy, followed by Margaret reciting prayers or incantations. Sometimes, she painted symbols on their bodies with a dark substance, possibly ink or blood. The ritual aspect was unmistakable, Dr. Marraro explains. But the practices didn't match any established religion. It seemed to be a personal mythology Margaret had invented. While Dr. Marraro treated the children, Cooper and federal agents searched the house for evidence. In Howard's study, they found a hidden safe containing forged adoption papers and large amounts of cash in multiple currencies. The most disturbing find, however, was a leather-bound journal in Margaret's handwriting, chronicling nearly 20 years of her ideology. In the journal, Margaret wrote about her mission to create a perfect family. She believed that children were born with sins that needed purging before they could become pure. The process involved severing ties to their birth families, erasing their identities and reshaping them according to her vision. In her mind, she wasn't abusing them, Cooper explains. She thought she was saving them. Margaret categorized the children as either redeemable or vessels. The 11 adopted children were redeemable, subjected to strict discipline and religious indoctrination. The vessels, like the 3 hidden children, served a different purpose. According to the journal, vessels were children deemed too corrupted to save. Margaret believed she could extract sin from the redeemable ones and transfer it to the vessels through her rituals. Once a vessel was full, Margaret claimed she could tell by looking into their eyes. They would then be discarded. Although the journal didn't specify how, it mentioned a resting place on the property where the filled ones sleep until Judgment Day. This led to the most gruesome part of the investigation, a search of the estate's grounds. In a remote wooded area, cadaver dogs alerted to a seemingly untouched patch of earth. Excavation uncovered the remains of 5 children in shallow graves, marked only by small stones. The oldest burial dated back around 14 years, shortly after the Follings adopted James. The most recent was less than a year old. The causes of death were consistent: malnutrition, dehydration, and exposure. Essentially, the children had been neglected to death. Identification was difficult due to the lack of records, but 3 of the 5 were tentatively matched to missing children: Maria Gomez, age 9, Tyrell Washington, age 7, and Alexi Petro, age 8. The other 2 remained unidentified, officially listed as Jane Doe 1 and John Doe 3. That's what still haunts me, Cooper says. Those 2 kids, someone loved them, someone missed them, but they died nameless, buried without ceremony as if they never existed. As evidence mounted, the case against the Follings seemed airtight, but the legal proceedings were complex. Howard hired a team of elite defense attorneys who portrayed him as an oblivious husband, too consumed by business to notice what was happening at home. They argued Margaret was the primary caregiver and orchestrator. It was a transparent strategy, says Assistant U.S. Attorney Meredith Lane, who prosecuted the case. Howard had signed the fraudulent papers, set up trust funds with strict conditions, and had the locked rooms built. He may not have performed the rituals, but he had facilitated them. Margaret was deemed mentally incompetent to stand trial. After evaluations revealed a severe delusional disorder centered on religious preoccupation, she was committed to a secure psychiatric facility, where she died in 2008. Denied the chance to blame everything on his wife, Howard shifted tactics, offering cooperation in exchange for a reduced sentence. He claimed he could reveal the locations of other vessels not found on their property. It was a painful choice, Lane admits. We wanted maximum penalties, but we also wanted to bring closure to more families. A deal was reached. Howard pled guilty to multiple charges, including child endangerment, kidnapping, and document fraud. In return, he received 25 years to life, with the possibility of parole after 20 years. Howard's information led to 3 additional burial sites on properties the Follings had briefly owned: a lake house in upstate New York, a hunting cabin in West Virginia, and a beach house in Maryland. 8 more children's remains were recovered, bringing the total to 13. Victims: 13. Vessels for 12 redeemable children. In Margaret's twisted logic, there had to be more vessels than redeemable ones, Cooper notes. Some vessels filled faster than others. Of the additional victims, 5 were identified: Lucia Diaz, age 9, Wami Johnson, age 7, Tran Nongguan, age 10, Sarah Blackfeather, age 8, and Dmitry Kowalski, age 6. All came from marginalized communities, where missing children often received minimal attention. The Follings preyed on children who wouldn't be missed, Lane says. They exploited systemic failures to adopt their redeemable children without proper checks. The fates of the 12 redeemable children were tragic. James, the eldest, died by suicide in 1998. Elizabeth suffered from severe anorexia. Thomas, the child whose broken arm drew initial attention, vanished at 18. Some younger children were adopted. Others remained in foster care until adulthood. The damage ran deep, says Dr. Marraro. These children were conditioned to believe their worth depended on suffering for purity. Therapy alone can't easily reverse that. The three hidden children, Sofia Mateo and Carlos Herrera, were eventually reunited with their family, migrant workers near San Diego. Their parents had reported them missing, but local police assumed the family had moved on. It was a miracle they were found alive, Cooper reflects. Based on Margaret's journal, Sofia was nearly filled. She would have been next to be discarded. Howard died in prison in 2011 after serving 16 years. He never showed remorse, insisting he only wanted to help Margaret build her family. His estate, worth several $1 million, was distributed to surviving victims via a civil settlement. The Follings house was demolished in 1997. In its place stands a community garden commemorating the children who died there. Each year, on the anniversary of the Follings arrest, residents gather to light 13 lanterns for the vessels and 12 candles for the redeemable children. It's not enough, Cooper says. It'll never be enough. But it's a way of remembering, of acknowledging what happened, and apologizing that we didn't see it sooner. The Follings case prompted lasting changes to adoption laws. The 1998 Follings Act in Pennsylvania mandates thorough background checks for adoptive parents, caps the number of adoptions per family within a set time frame, and requires home visits for the first 5 years post-adoption. We all failed those children, Lane admits. The neighbors who stayed silent, the doctors who missed the signs, the officials swayed by Howard's wealth and law enforcement, which didn't take early warnings seriously. Perhaps the most unsettling thought is that there might be more victims. Howard only disclosed sites linked directly to the Follings. Given their travels, it's likely more vessels remain undiscovered. I've accepted that we'll never know the full extent, Cooper says. But I haven't made peace with the fact that some parents still don't know what became of their children. That's why I keep returning to the case files, even in retirement. Every lead matters because those children deserve names. They deserve their stories to be told. And so the grim history of the Follings continues to unfold. Even decades after their crimes first came to light, it remains a stark reminder of the darkness that can lurk behind a facade of respectability, the vulnerable children who slip through societal cracks, and the devastating consequences when those entrusted with their care betray that sacred duty. Before we conclude today's episode, we must take a moment to honor the families of the identified victims: Maria Gomez, Terrell Washington, Alexi Petro, Lucia Diaz, Kwame Johnson, Tran Nongwan, Sarah Blackfeather, and Dmitry Kowalski. Their lives were stolen by unimaginable cruelty. Yet by sharing their stories, we ensure they are not forgotten. To Jane Doe number 1, John Doe number 3, and the 3 remaining unidentified children, though your names are unknown, your suffering is not. You mattered then. You matter now. This has been the Ghastly Journal. Remember to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss future episodes. If you or someone you know has information about missing children, please contact the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children at 1-800-THE-LOST. Sometimes even after decades, the truth still surfaces. Until next time, stay vigilant. The darkest deeds often occur where we least expect them. In the years since the Follings case first shocked the nation, many theories have circulated about the origins of Margaret's disturbing beliefs. While the official investigation focused on identifying victims and building a legal case, scholars and true crime enthusiasts have continued to explore the psychological and possibly cultural roots of Margaret's rituals. Dr. Eliza Montgomery, a professor of religious studies at the University of Pennsylvania, has dedicated years to studying Margaret's journals and court testimonies. What's particularly notable about Margaret's belief system is that it doesn't align with any formal religious tradition, Montgomery explains. There are elements people might recognize: sin, purification through suffering, ritual cleansing, but combined in ways entirely unique to her. Montgomery suggests that Margaret's background may offer some insight. Born Margaret Phelps in 1945, she grew up in a small rural farming community in Minnesota. Neighbors described her parents as deeply religious yet reclusive, often keeping their children from school and community gatherings. There were long-standing rumors about unusual religious practices in the Phelps household. Nothing concrete, nothing provable, Montgomery notes, but enough to make them an enigma. Those few who still remember the Phelps family recall them as secretive and peculiar. At 18, Margaret left home for nursing school in Minneapolis, severing ties with her family. Records show she never returned for holidays, and her family did not attend her graduation. She was a diligent student, specializing in pediatric care and drawn to working with children from the outset. Yet there remains a significant gap in the record of Margaret's life between her graduation in 1965 and her marriage to Howard Falling in 1976. We know she worked at various hospitals across the Midwest, rarely staying in one place for long, Montgomery says. And we know she spent time in Europe in the early 1970s, though the purpose of that trip is unclear. It was during this European period that Margaret may have encountered obscure religious texts that later shaped her beliefs. Among the items seized during the investigation was a collection of manuscripts, some dating back to the 17th century, covering esoteric subjects such as alchemy, Gnosticism, and mystical practices centered on spiritual transference, the notion that sin or virtue could pass from one vessel to another. These weren't mainstream religious texts, Montgomery emphasizes. They were rare, often incomplete works that Margaret likely sought out intentionally, indicating a pre-existing interest. By the time Margaret met Howard, Falling at a charity event in Pittsburgh in 1975, she had already developed the core of her belief system, a system she apparently concealed from her future husband, at least in the beginning. Howard, by contrast, wasn't religious. His focus was wealth and social status, pursued with determination. Whether Howard ever truly understood or believed in Margaret's views remains uncertain, according to Detective Cooper. In his testimony, Howard claimed he thought Margaret's interest in adoption stemmed from a desire to help disadvantaged children, combined with her inability to have biological ones. He insisted that by the time he recognized the religious underpinnings, he was too entangled to leave. Yet Cooper remained skeptical. Howard was smart and observant. The idea that he lived in that house for 15 years without knowing it strains credibility. Dr. Montgomery offers another perspective. Perhaps Howard saw Margaret's beliefs as eccentric but harmless. There's evidence he loved her, at least early on. People in love often dismiss or rationalize behaviors that would alarm others. Regardless of his understanding, Howard enabled Margaret through his wealth and connections. Without his resources to expedite adoptions, purchase secluded properties, and deflect suspicion, Margaret's activities might have been uncovered much earlier. They were a perfect storm, Cooper says. Margaret with her warped vision, Howard with the means to realize it, and caught in between were 25 children whose lives were devastated. Those 25 children included 12 officially adopted, subjected to years of psychological and physical abuse, and 13 vessels, who suffered severe neglect before being killed once. Margaret deemed them irredeemably filled with sin. Of the 12 adopted children, only 9 are alive today. James died by suicide, Thomas disappeared, and Catherine overdosed in 2007. The surviving 9 have mostly stayed out of the public eye, changing their names to escape the shadow of their past. Only Elizabeth, now in her 40s, has spoken publicly. In a 2015 documentary interview, she recalled the persistent fear inside the Falling household. "We were always scared of upsetting them," she said. "We called them sir and madam. They had so many rules, and they changed all the time. What was okay one day could get you punished the next. You were constantly on edge." She also described the cleansing rituals. Margaret would make them drink bitter tea, kneel in a chalked circle, recite passages in an unknown language, and touch their foreheads with a cold, damp finger. Sometimes she would make small cuts to collect their blood in a silver cup. The children were told these rituals removed the badness inherited from their birth families. "Madam said we were born with sin like a disease," Elizabeth recalled. "If we resisted," she said, "the sin would grow until we'd have to live upstairs with the bad children." The bad children, the vessels, were occasionally shown to the adopted children as a warning. "She made us look through a little window," Elizabeth said. "They were so thin, so dirty, their eyes dead inside." Madam would say, "This is what happens when the sin takes over." This psychological terror, combined with physical deprivation and isolation, created total dependency. Dr. Mororo explains, "It's a classic cult structure. The leader defines truth and reality, cutting off any outside perspective. Over time, the victims internalize this worldview. Even after their removal, many children continued to defend their adoptive parents. It wasn't Stockholm Syndrome, Dr. Mororo clarifies. These children had no alternative framework to understand their abuse. Recovery was slow and painful. Some, like James, never healed. Others, like Elizabeth, oscillate between progress and relapse, still battling the scars of their upbringing. The tragedy isn't just the 13 who died, Dr. Mororo says, but the 12 who lived, yet were never allowed to fully become who they might have been. Researchers have since recognized similar patterns in other cases of extreme child abuse, especially those with religious or cult elements. Isolation, ritualism, and the exploitation of children's dependency create conditions where cruelty can flourish. What sets the Falling case apart, Montgomery points out, is its scale, duration, and the respectability that masked it. This wasn't a hidden compound. This was a prominent family in a typical American town. Churchgoers, community leaders hiding in plain sight. When concerns arose, Dr. Chen noticing Thomas's injuries, Susan Fletcher voicing her suspicions, they were too easily dismissed. That's the lesson here, Cooper insists. Not just the horror inside that house, but the ordinary failures that allowed it to continue. Neighbors not wanting to pry, officials accepting easy explanations, colleagues avoiding risk. These small failures multiplied across a community let the Follings crimes persist. And similar dynamics, Cooper warns, continue today. Someone notices but says nothing, or reports but fails to follow up, while an overburdened system drops the case. Children from marginalized backgrounds, the poor, immigrants, foster kids remain especially vulnerable. The Falling case is not ancient history, it's a warning. Sometimes the monster isn't hiding under the bed, but living on the corner, respected, even admired. Margaret spent her final 13 years in a secure psychiatric facility, deemed mentally unfit for trial. Staff reported that she continued private rituals, insisting until her death from breast cancer in 2008 that she was fulfilling God's mission. In a final journal entry, she wrote, "They think the mission is stopped, but it continues on another plane. The vessels are filled, the redeemable are cleansed. When judgment comes, they'll see I was right." Howard, meanwhile, wrote a memoir in prison titled Blind Trust, portraying himself as Margaret's victim. Courts blocked its publication, but copies circulate among researchers. "I loved my wife," he wrote. "I believed in her kindness, her desire to help. By the time I saw her delusion, I was trapped by love, fear, and complicity. I'm not blameless, but I'm not the monster they claim." Cooper rejects this outright. It's self-serving. Howard wasn't duped. He was a willing participant. He may not have shared her beliefs, but he enjoyed the power and admiration that came with them. Regardless of his motivations, the outcome remains. Children suffered and died. A community was left to reckon with the darkness it failed to see. Today, the Follings case is studied by law enforcement, social workers, psychologists, and scholars. A lesson in how abuse hides behind wealth and status, how toxic belief systems evolve, and how the vulnerable still fall through the cracks. If any good emerged, Cooper says, it's greater vigilance. Laws have changed. Awareness has grown. We are reminded to ask hard questions and not accept easy answers. In the community garden where the Falling house once stood, 25 trees grow, 12 oaks for the redeemable, 13 willows for the vessels, a living memorial to resilience and hope. We close this chapter of the Falling story, a narrative of horror, but also of courage, the courage of Susan Fletcher, Maria Vasquez, Detective Cooper, and above all, the surviving children who live with burdens no child should bear. May we honor them with vigilance. May we never again let respectability and wealth shield evil. And may we remember the names we know: Maria, Terrell, Alex, Lucia, Kwame, Transera, Dimitri, and those we may never know whose lives mattered equally.